that people keep saying that we're becoming polarized as a society. We're not becoming polarized as a society, we're becoming more honest as a society. And the fundamental problem in South Africa was this decision taken way back in the 90s to privatize the difficult conversations.
Just start with a small icebreaker. Everybody introduce themselves, and yeah. So we start with you, just the icebreaker. Who is Khaya Sithole? For those who don't know, our audience, very youthful audience, and yeah.
Well, the problem of wearing a mask is that people can't tell when I'm smiling or when I'm horrified. My name is Khaya, and the idea of an icebreaker seems to assume that there's some frosty relations between us, which doesn't exist. So yeah, that's who I am, and I piss off people for a living.
I'm Mokami Migeti. I liked my expertise. I'm the episode of an activist for change.
So that's great. And I see you're wearing a Springbok jersey, so I think we can start with that.
I wore this jersey because I was watching Chasing the Sun. And the documentary, the whole sun emotions, and I think really as a country, we need more of such moments because we seem to be, just moving our parts all the time.
Yeah, I recently made it's funny you mentioned I recently made a comment about the Springboks. What you see, I don't think he's the captain in that squad. Just looking at the dynamics, and I would face a lot of backlash for saying something like that.
Why would you say such a thing?
It doesn't look like the rest of the team, especially looks like he gets undermined by more of the senior players, especially. I don't know if it's racial tensions or what, but I'm not gonna say there is racial tension.
How did you work that out?
I mean, having watched Chasing the Sun, especially in the change rooms whenever they're speaking, you can see who's the more dominant forces are the Dwayne Familiars, the exhibits in the teams, you know what I mean, the more senior, and I don't want to put race into it, but it seems like there's some sort of race relation between all of that.
Or maybe the hallmark of a good captain is a person who spends more time listening to the views of other people and then saying this is how I'm going to lead the team, isn't that the way it's supposed to work?
I mean, I guess. What do you think?
I think the self-policy one is a bit tricky in the sense that it goes down to leadership style. Commonly, we associate the captain as the guy who will give out instructions, inspiration. Chelsea, the likes of John Terry. Man United.
Didn't he slip when he was supposed to score something? That should be your best reference point.
I mean, fair. And I mean also just the traditional of Springbok captains. Jean de Villiers always used to be the one you could see that, okay, no, the captain is speaking now. But I do think with Siakodis, his personality is not that kind of person.
Yeah.
He's one of those, humble gents. And even in the first game, he says himself that when I did feel overwhelmed, I've always found it easier that there are people around me to support me.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think it's a leadership style question. What we all have to ask ourselves, I think, beyond who says what in the team is, does Sia's performance give the guys enough inspiration to push? And at times I have thought that anybody injured, I was like, okay.
Guys, he is the World Cup winning captain. Isn't that the ultimate litmus test?
It is.
Yeah. I mean, what are we trying to chase here? He won a bloody World Cup.
He did, but I mean, off his, I don't want to seem like I'm against or agreeing with the ball. I'm not agreeing with the ball. But I think what he's speaking of is the traditional sense of looking at a team captain. This guy, we look to you for leadership, and I don't let those gents in the Springboks do that.
I don't know, he led them to an entire World Cup. That's what I saw when I was in Japan.
No, look, I mean, I don't agree with what Bonga said. I think that Usia is playing a crucial role in the team, and given the fact that they were going through a very difficult period when he was brought in, right? So they needed someone like Siakodisi to run so that the entire nation rallies behind the team. Because remember, the support plays a critical role in ensuring that the team yields the result. So we'll see. Personally, I think he's a good captain.
Yeah.
You support Kaizer Chiefs, don't you?
I don't have an interest in South African.
But you would be a Chiefs fan.
Traditionally, in fact, growing up, I was a Chiefs fan.
Instead of single
But
I'm gonna bring up Khaya.
I'm just saying.
But this sort of segues into I think the main crux of what I really want us to talk about today which was the racial tensions in the country and decolonization, especially, and I want us to touch as to how far can we take that? What is decolonization? We've never interacted with the idea, and what is sparking all the racial tensions we're seeing. Recently there was that Brackenfell incident where whether you're on the left or on the right, people have their views and it's heightened views. So I really want to get it, and you're wearing Khaya, which I think is something people might think is decolonial in its approach, which is maybe incorporating our sense of heritage, our sense of culture within our everyday lifestyle.
Maybe I couldn't afford an expensive hat with a ring.
It could be that, but I'm just saying, So does anyone want to tackle that issue? What has led to the point that we're at now where we see a lot of racial tensions in the country?
I think I'm not gonna define what decolonization means, but I think what we're seeing today is a reflection of what has always been there in South Africa, right? Our rainbow nation has always been very political, right? Mm-hmm. So there are fundamental issues that we need to tackle, that we need to deal with, right? For us to really move on and given our dark past as South Africa. So I think we must give it time. Maybe we'll.
Okay.
But I don't know. I think for me the inequality gap in South Africa is increasing in an interesting way, in the sense that I think we start to see a bit more of black inclusion in established means of wealth. So it's like a black person's either getting more poor or a bit more richer if you are closer to wealth. And if your proximity was closer to wealth, you are actually getting into the bracket of, if you went to had a chance at a decent university, was brought up in a family that in any case was historically wealthy. I think that we are seeing that these within black communities are also themselves stretching, which makes the vulnerability of black people increase in communities. And that's why I think there's a transcendence in churches that do weird things such as claim to people that I'll make you walk, and then people are actually paying for these products whereby there are player products that people are paying for now. I think that speaks to the spiritual vulnerability that the poverty is bringing into communities of black people. The racial tension, I think it's a number of things, mainly the way that our media is structured up these ways. Because you don't find this kind of tension everywhere, not everywhere. So you'll find very active places like Gauteng, Western Cape, and the likes. And also, I think that speaks to the question of space. Look at Gauteng, look at how close we are racially to dealing with each other. Being of an Eastern Cape, Eastern Cape, the minorities are in their own islands, for instance, from my experience. So I think that now what's also happening is that a lot of people are losing jobs. A lot of people are losing jobs. Other people are still transcending financially within these bad economic times. You also see claims of corruption with how do guys use COVID-19 to get rich. It builds a rage, because you're seeing more and more people become poor. So I think for me, it's the inequality gap in South Africa just stretching out, and it's building anger amongst people.
Yeah, because I feel like with that, the conversation has become more polarized. For example, the issue of farm murders. You might find it is probably an issue like safety in rural communities. But because of the racial tensions, it seems that if you speak on farm murders, whether you for or against, you then almost pick a side and people say, why are you speaking on this? We have bigger issues to speak on. Like that, the thing of whataboutism, I think is what people refer to. Or whatever, what about this? What about that? So how do you respond to that in terms of why have we become so polarized in our conversations? Why can't we find middle ground in things that we can both agree that is probably wrong or is probably an injustice, but because it's linked to a race or a particular race, we then want to sort of racialize it or polarize it so much that we don't find any solution to it.
Polarized as if it's a recent phenomenon. I think we've probably become more honest about who we are, the character of who we are as South Africans. And I was speaking to John Steele Mason this week about even the whole concept of farm murders, and I asked him, well, for a country that has a general crisis with people killing each other, how do you then zero in on farm murders and make it the thing that you must champion? And of course, the question of what interests people champion is fundamentally linked to what they think matters most to them. And unfortunately, if those people are in the political space, they then attach that to what attracts political capital for them. So it's not an innocent choice. So the DA didn't wake up and say, let's go through the list of all the crimes. Hey, that looks like it's a crisis point. It was something that they were very clear that if we speak about that, it's going to speak to the lost constituency. So they still believe that there's a lost constituency of people who abandoned them in 2019 and went over to the Freedom Front class.
Yeah.
And of course, the history of your country being what it is, the majority of the farmers, or what you guys call the Boers, are people that would have identified with the Freedom Front class because it does speak fundamentally to those issues. So the DA has found itself caught in this trap of trying to regain that particular constituency. Unfortunately, yesterday's by-elections indicate that progress is just not happening.
Yeah.
But the question that people keep saying that we're becoming polarized as a society, we're not becoming polarized as a society, we're becoming more honest as a society. And the fundamental problem in South Africa was this decision taken way back in the 90s to privatize the difficult conversations. So when white people used to be comfortable in being explicit about who they are and what they thought about black people, the social compact reach was the fact that you just cannot say this in a public space. You just cannot treat them like this in a public space. But that didn't deal with the underlying question of how they had ended up speaking about the public space, because this is a question of grooming, it's a question of breeding. So if a person grows up in a particular environment and they simply share the view that they are much better than you, because of what they look like, that they're much superior than you because of what they look like. If the rules of the land say that just don't say it out loud, they'll find a way not to say it out loud, but it doesn't mean that they don't believe it.
Yeah.
So it's not a new thing, because if you say that we're becoming polarized, I'll be like, well, what was the trigger point? What happened in the past 2 or 3 years that suddenly made white people more racist? And that's not the case. The people who are racist have been racist forever. It's just a matter of polite society made it very unpopular for them to do so. And you raise a very important point in that in some sectors of society, those tensions are unavoidable because of the social squeeze. And when you talk about the social squeeze, it's when you're competing for particular resources, and in that competition for resources, people start resenting each other. Because if I am trying to queue for a job and I don't get the job because you're in front of me of the line, the reason I didn't get the job is because of you. It's not because there aren't enough job opportunities. So the resentment is much easier towards a person I can see to say, had that person not existed, I would have received that benefit myself. So I'm much easier to channel that anger towards you. So when you talk about that social compression, it's when unfortunately people who are forced to compete for particular resources do not have the luxury of walking away from points of conflict. They do not have the luxury of saying, well, screw that, I'm going to go to the next restaurant, I'm going to go to the next beach, because they have to deal with the situation as it presents itself. And unfortunately, the way situations present itself is that far too many people think that they're better than other people because of what they look like. And this is not something that is just unique across racial classes. It's also something that transcends across, social classes. I mean, let's face it, UCT students still think they're much better than 4th students, no matter how they try to deny it. We may make it difficult for them to say it on Twitter, but that doesn't mean that they don't believe it. Yeah. And I've always been of the opinion that this idea of forcing people to socialize, to privatize their prejudices simply means that we're going to have these multiple, explosion points over time, rather than us dealing with the fundamental issue once off. So these multiple explosion points are going to manifest in multiple ways. You saw it this week, it was a Brackenfell incident, and of course, it is so contentious, the question of who matters and who doesn't matter, and that if the way things are, there's a community dominated by white people, they do something in particular, and then the EFF comes and says, this is a problem. You're going to lose the question of dealing with the problem that is being raised, because as soon as the conflict starts, it's white people versus black people.
Yeah.
And the way society has sort of fashioned itself, and perhaps the media has a role to play in this, in that if I show up and I'm representing the EFF, I look black, I look rudimentary, I'm not wearing a suit, it's much easier for me to say that is a fact. A person who shows up like this is not going to get called a fact. So already, even before anything happens, they are facts, and those are the gentlemen.
Yeah.
So when we start framing people and compartmentalizing people into those types of spaces, it then does create the environment for us losing the essence of what the problem is, and then gravitating into our zones of comfort or even zones of discomfort, and then start throwing stones at each other without dealing with the underlying issue. I still think that the approach of forcing people to simply privatize prejudices rather than us having what the Germans would call a Nuremberg moment of literally confronting the issue up front and saying that after we've had that social discourse, these things are prohibited. You may not praise the Holocaust regardless of what the provocation is. In South Africa, I have to explain myself. In South Africa, I have to justify why apartheid cannot be spoken about. We had an interesting conversation this week. Madigizela from Western Cape is a DA leader from Western Cape. So he was being asked to explain why the DA had compared the EFF to the Nazi party, as it were. So he went on and on and on. At some point in time, somebody said to him, but you do know some things just should not be said. He's like, no, nothing cannot be said. So if somebody calls me they've got the right to say so because they're freedom of speech. If I get offended, it's my problem. You could never get away with such nonsense in Germany. But the problem in South Africa is that it's not only just white people who believe that. You clearly have a black person who's a political leader who himself says there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
People's freedom of expression is a sacred right, and in the South African context, it cannot be a sacred right. It has to be a limited right, because we know the pain that these words have caused. So of course, I'm still much more comfortable with a person like him saying it out loud, because now we know what the problem that we're dealing with is, rather than us pretending that this problem doesn't exist. So now it's much easier for us to engage on the basis that I know exactly what your underlying prejudices are, I know exactly what you think of me, so that when things happen, when tensions escalate, I am not operating a blind spot of trying to figure out what the hell happened, and then trying to find all these red herrings and say, well, surely it must have been that, surely it must have been that. I should know exactly what it is that you think and what it is that you feel. And sometimes South Africans, by avoiding those explicit confrontations, you simply defer it.
Yeah.
And by deferring it, it's going to explode in a manner that is really beyond their control. And I think that's what you see in places like Senekal and even places like Brackenfell. And again, unfortunately, once you bring political parties into it, it's very difficult to distinguish between championing of a cause versus the political capital associated with it. So I even ask STNAs in this question of, is the DA a party that is fundamentally concerned about farm mergers, or is this a party that seeks to gain political capital out of the issue of people being murdered on farms? And you're never going to get an answer from politicians around that.
No, I definitely agree. Very elaborate, and I appreciate the comprehensive sort of answer, because it gives people a well-rounded understanding of just how deep sort of the problems are or whatever, than leaving things on surface level. And you raise an interesting point, which I want, especially because it's with students, really caught my attention about institutional privilege, who matters, who doesn't. Do you guys think institutional privilege is something that exists?
Do you really think you should ask with students?
I really I want to really see what they have to say about that.
Yeah, I think it does. Actually, there's something Khaya was saying about the problem with privatizing these kind of conversations. And I was going to say that I'm not sure that we can all participate in conversations, though, unfortunately. Because I think the poorer you are in South Africa is the more powerless you are. So as much as I, as let's say a domestic worker in these offices, and white people come in and they're openly racist to me, openly, I still can't say anything, because firstly I'm earning about probably 350 per week, and if I fuck this up, then I'm really screwed and my family is really screwed. So I do think that there's something beyond just the sense that people should be openly, I don't know, prejudicial, openly. I do think that there's also a question of what kind of protection do you get, because clearly it's not the law. People in South Africa can be racist, even if it's considered illegal. It doesn't serve anyone's purpose, everyone's purpose. But on the question of institutional, definitely. I think fees must fall would have never caught this much attention if it was a university of Fort Hare, for instance. And in fact, police can find it easier to go there and just open fire on students for this. Full education has long been protested for in South Africa, way before Wits University, way before the University of Cape Town. Fees must fall, in fact, was in many ways ideologically a step back at first, because we were saying don't increase fees, whereas a lot of other students in South Africa saying we can't afford fees, so we need a full education. Then it matured into a movement of full education, but that's where you saw within this actually the dichotomies that exist within black students themselves, because other black students are middle class and their problem is genuinely if you increase fees. A lot of people claim that they can't afford fees, but they also here out of desperation. So bursar is coming, and the likes. And those are the people that was actually most difficult to mobilize, because they're like, look man, if I don't study, my bursary, I lose that, and I'm gone, I'm back in the ghetto. So it became, for me, where I'm sitting, it became that within the institution of this, there are still people that have a bit more privilege to speak out, black or white. So within this, like there are people with a cushion. So there are some, so that for instance, it might be easier for a child who's self-funding to go to a fees must fall protest if they speak out. And if you do get arrested, your parents will be there, if there's a lawyer for you and this whatnot. A child from Limpopo, here with a bursary, the impact of having a failed year academically is much more it's much more severe, but they actually need this a lot more than that.
Yeah.
So within WITS, within the institution itself, I think that there are people that are more powerless than the others. I wouldn't say there's anyone powerful within the marginalized, but there's those with less power, lesser power amongst the powerless.
It goes back even in history. If you think about liberation movements, they've always been led by people who came from privileged families. Think about the leaders of the ANC before the 70s, right? Your Chief Agbelutulis, your Mandelas, your Tambos, your whoever. It was people who came from, these families where they could afford to be, activists.
Yeah.
Right? It was never people who would think about what am I going to eat? Where is my next meal going to come from?
Yeah.
So I think it sums up the nature of, activism, right? It always favors those who can afford to do it. And if you can't, I don't have time. If I have to think about what am I gonna eat tonight, I don't have time to go and protest and think about, oh my God, fees must fall, blah blah blah, right?
Yeah.
And I think going back to the issues of South Africa, right? We need to address them. We need to confront these issues. Obviously, we don't need to privatize them. But what makes it very difficult in the South African context is the fact that majority of these issues are racialized and they are class-based, right? So without dealing with the fundamental, the underlying issues, which is, the resources, it's going to be very difficult for us. Because remember, a white person cannot be, I don't care how a white person feels towards me if they don't have the power to deprive me of education, access to education, if they don't have the power to deprive me of, good quality job. If I can sustain myself, I really don't care how a white person feels towards me.
Sure.
What makes it very painful is if the person who's racist towards me can actually have the power to not give me a job, has the power to kick me out of school. So I think what makes it very difficult and why maybe these things have always been privatized because that we don't have, practical solutions of dealing with underlying issues, which are the crux of the problem.
No, I agree. And I guess that then leads to what people would want to say is, which my understanding of decolonization and sort of like black and African people sort of taking up more space and and getting those resources so that you can be redistributed and have that form of redress. And I really want us to touch on that. A lot of people have a misunderstanding of what is decolonization, what purpose does it serve, and why are people even speaking about it? Would you like to tackle
The one thing that I kept saying during Fees Must Fall in 2015 is that was the one thing that we actually had no idea what it is that we were talking about. And I think the problem with the concept of decolonization is that it was such a very poorly articulated idea, even from the time that it sort of gained traction. There have been people who've been speaking about this for generations. You would have heard stories of UCT, the Mafeji affair, the Mamdani affair. So these are the things that have always sort of been simmering in the world of humanities, for example. But when 2015 happened and it suddenly became part of this conversation that we're trying to have, at no point in time did somebody pause and say, so what exactly does it all mean in the context of what we're trying to deal with? And if you remember, there was that famous video of someone at UCT who said we must decolonize mathematics. It became a laughing point for a lot of people, but it left a lingering a set of questions for me to say, well, what exactly is it that we want to be able to say in the context of decolonization in the higher education space, for example? And should it be a higher education conversation? Because the one thing that I always remind people is that higher education in South Africa isn't a thing. A very small fraction of people ever make it, and an even smaller fraction of people ever succeed from it. So if you go to frame South African society on the basis of who's in higher education, it's the same thing with you people thinking that Twitter represents South Africa. It doesn't. It represents the people who have data and who have time to waste and who speak the type of English that's acceptable on Twitter, because if your English is broken, Twitter's not for you anyway, you're going to get bullied off the platform. So those things do not represent South African society. In fact, the higher education system represents the elites of South African society, and those elites aren't necessarily just financial elites, they might be academic elites, because if you didn't have good results in metric, you wouldn't be able to make it higher education anyway. So when you say the concept of elite, people assume that you mean rich. No, you don't. You mean in the context of what other people have been able to do, are you in a much better position, and the fact that you could access higher education puts you into that elite. And I felt that it was a conversation that was being held at precisely the wrong level. And this was at the level of the people who could afford to get into an academic.
But is the argument not that, like, for example, a subject like maths and physics, this Zulu doesn't have the dialect.
No, that argument is absolute rubbish.
You don't agree with
Absolute
that?
rubbish. Because this seems to be operating from the premise that maths can only be taught in English. But no, if you go to China, do they teach maths in English? Of course they don't, because they don't teach it in English. So there is absolutely no merit to this idea that a subject like maths itself cannot be replicated or taught in a particular language. The issue here is that you've never bothered to invest in the type of linguistics and the human and social capital that would enable you to say, actually, this is how we teach this in a language so that people can understand it. And there is this great problem that we have as South Africa and perhaps as Africans, in that we assume that English is the language of the world. No, it isn't. The English is the language preferred by the countries that were colonized by the British. That is literally what the issue is here. So even, this week when people are saying, why is Patrice running? Because, Francophone Africa is not going to vote for him. The fact that you've got an idea of Francophone Africa means that in some parts of Africa, then French is the thing, as it were. So do they teach maths in English then? Of course not. They teach it in the language that they speak. So this idea that it cannot be replicated in other languages, it's absolute rubbish.
So, Khaya, as someone who's been in academia, what's your, how is it set up? Like, for instance, at the UKZN, how are the lecturers there predominantly? Is it still mostly white?
UKZN is the same place where Makhoba, in around 2000 and just before he left, Makhoba comes up with this idea that we should make Zulu a compulsory module for every single student. Because his view was that it just made no sense that a person can say, I studied at university in KZN, but I can't even grade a person. And he was just like, that just doesn't make sense. So he actually started that project long ago at UKZN, and I was on the Senate, and he used to be challenged on that. But obviously, Makhoba, he used to be challenged with everything because he had this wonderful ability to alienate rather than unite, whatever the conversation was. But it actually was an interesting project in that he said you should have it as a universal requirement that a person must be able to at least converse at the very bare minimum in that language. Because there's no point in saying that you are running a medical school in KZN and the people that are in that medical school are going to go and serve the communities in KZN, and then for them to get there and say they can't speak to their patients because the patients don't speak Zulu. We already know that the patients don't speak English, don't speak English. So there's no point in you saying you're an academic institution and then not taking up the responsibility of saying, well, if I'm going to produce graduates that are going to serve a particular society, they need to be responsive to what that society is, rather than what we wish it to be. And in the South African context, far too many people do not speak the type of fancy English that you and I are using here. So why can't we then ensure that every graduate who says I'm going to go and serve that particular community is at least able to engage at some level in the respect. And it's a duty of universities in my view. And Makhoba was right about that. And Makhoba and I hardly agree on it. But I think we got that one right.
Yeah, and I really agree because, for example, these conversations are held in English. For example, we're talking about decolonization. What does Khuluma Zulu? We're not speaking native languages. We're speaking English in forums which are, like you said, elite or whatever. So I think if we're going to extend it, at least it must be into broader communities, and at least let's try to understand each other's languages in that discourse, because it's pointless saying we're decolonizing but within the context of colonialism, which is English, obviously. And in wrapping, what is the way forward? What is it going to take?
A book has just been published, and in that book, the title is "Should We Go?" So someone called me beginning of the year. They're like, "So what is still here?" I'm like, "What the hell do you mean?" They're like, "Well, surely you can afford to emigrate. Why the hell are you still stuck in this mess?" And I actually then had to write an entire chapter of the book explaining why I would never leave. So obviously, I'm not going to tell you what I said because then you won't buy the book.
Yeah.
But the crux of that is that you have to ask yourself the silly question of whether you think the country can be fixed. And if you believe that the country can be fixed, what do you do in order to make sure that happens? So I actually reached that state of mind about 10 years ago. And I said that I think the best chance of fixing it is through the education system. That's how I can involve in academia. Other people believe that it can be done differently. That's fine. And I think we should support different ways of approaching it. And so for me, it's a matter of how do you get many more people to ask themselves the question and find the answer that they're comfortable with and then implement it. Because far too many people say, you're going to ask us this question now, we can tell you exactly what needs to be done, and then we're going to walk out of here, we're going to go home, you're going to go to your corner, and then we'll never ever do any of that. So I always just sit out this conversation and I'd rather show you what I've done already. I'd rather show you what it is that I've committed to and then say, that's what I thought was going to happen. If I turn out to be completely wrong, then so be it, but at least I tried something. But far too many people, exist in the anecdotal rather than the reality of what it is that we should be doing. So a lot of things can be done. I strongly believe that once people are educated and liberated, the multiplier effect on society is much greater than any other initiative. Other people say you must go into politics, but according to the by-elections, it doesn't matter what politicians do to screw over society because they'll vote them in anyway. So that's not the way to go. So yeah, I think education is the way.
But you've been very quiet, observant.
For me, I think I'm going to give a very broad answer. I think really, whether through education and training, whether ensuring that people are equipped, it's really about ensuring that we broaden, access to opportunities, right? The problem with South Africa is that we probably have the same amount of, access to job opportunities as we did maybe 5 years ago, right? Sure. We keep recycling. MK comes, he works in an internship at Nedbank, he goes out. This one comes, he goes out. This one comes, and I think we have to broaden. We have to create new companies. We have to create a continent which has been proven. You need SMMEs. SMMEs are the biggest employers in big, large economies. Mm. So that's really where we need to focus on instead of assimilating. I think Khaya at some point spoke about the idea of our transformation in South Africa, which is assimilation into the already existing structures, which has proven to not be, it doesn't yield the desired results.
Yeah.
So I think we really need to, I know how we're going to go about doing that, but maybe, let's support entrepreneurship. I know MK really might come with the land issue. And but I legit think we need to really look at this thing in broader terms.
Yeah.
Look, man, I think it's a tough one, especially because I personally think 2029 South Africa will get into coalition governments. I think the next election ANC will retain majority. 2029, I think definitely we start seeing coalition governments. And I think it will bring a big question of the identity of the country at the time. That okay, fine.
I need to ask you a silly question. Will South Africa survive until 2029?
So that's harder than his question. But from my perspective, financially,
Economic.
It's 2020. If you look at the trajectory of the country, whether you're talking about its economic prospects or even the racial tensions, do you think this country can afford to sustain itself at this level for the next 9 years?
probably.
It's definitely possible.
Probably. I think it's possible. Probably. But just because the culture has always been chaotic.
You do realize that this very morning we were told that the youth unemployment rate is 61.3%. Talk me through how you see us keeping this going for the next 9 years.
Do you think we're at our lowest?
No, it's always been like that.
Youth unemployment is 61%. Do you understand what that means?
I'm not diminishing that, but I'm asking a genuine question, Uguti. Do you think the country at its lowest now as it's ever been in its history?
Well, this is a country that once used to practice explicit racism, so I don't think you're ever going to plunge to those depths ever again. But my worry is that if you don't find the solutions to the problems that you have now, I'm not seeing this 9-year vision that all of you seem to have.
But on the question of what you're asking, I'm more with Khaya on education because I think that underlying South Africa needs a good distribution of wealth.
Sure.
I genuinely think that we are just too unequal in South Africa. The fact that you can have a Sandton right next to an Alexandra is scary and it's normal. Doesn't scare anyone. You know the fact.
Sure.
Sometimes when you take a taxi out of Sandton and you literally switch into another society, but it's just once. So you stay in Junction. Junction is here, beautiful island. People are privileged. Expensive cars for you. You cross one street, you help. Literally, your life changes from crossing one street. So I think for me, somehow we need to find solutions that will make this complete well. I've heard some people proposing a wealth tax. I don't know how far that will get us because all tax is expensive in South Africa. It doesn't really serve the people as well. So I think underlying issue for me is a distribution of wealth. I don't know how it will come.
Yeah.
I don't trust our government.
No, I think there's a lot we can chat about until the sun goes down. I really appreciate the conversation. You sound like you're about to say you're going to plunge into a civil war, get a brain drain, everyone leaves the country, and you will be left with absolutely nothing. But I'm a bit more optimistic. I have faith towards it. We have some good people who are still around, who are still, like you just said now, the things that you've done in academia, there's a lot of good things, initiatives, people you've helped, things like that. Obviously, it doesn't fix the whole structural thing, but I think the more patriotism we build, there is some sort of hope, and we're a country that comes from adversity and has overcome adversity in most difficult times. And I think we need more conversations. We're a country born through conversation. So I really appreciate your time, everyone coming out today.
So since you asked us at 10 minutes, the next 10 minutes, okay, I'll buy
Let's
the
work
book.
on 1 year time. Let's work.
Okay, I'll buy the book.
Buy the book, the answer to the book.
Yeah,
South Africa will survive.
we'll survive.
How long?
Okay, I'm not sure about the horizon, but I think
We'll survive.
Okay.
It depends what image survival takes. I think South Africa will even make it possible.
I don't think the
Really?
civil war is
Yeah.
possible.
I don't know, the civil war will go up again and continue.
A civil law probably is not possible. Look at
Senekal.
Look at how hostile society was to something like Fizz must fall, for example. Because you must remember, society wasn't supporting Fizz must fall. So if something like that, our South African society is not for a revolution. South Africans are not for violence. So I think civil war is a no for now, right?
Yeah. I hope you're right.
So before we wrap up, I just want to say huge thank you to Zico Investments or Zungo and Main. They allowed us to use their facilities to film. I think we need more people like that who just assist young people across the country in various spaces. Maybe our space of film tomorrow could be someone buying, maybe if you have a small business, anything you can do to assist young people or anyone in general. Like I think we can take inspiration from people like that. And yeah, huge shout out to them. Hopefully wish them all the best. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.